So, here we go. Thank you everyone for coming to this presentation. Michael Woodson is going to be presenting on Capital and History today. The subtitle was Does Marxism Even Matter? Just a little bit about Platypus. We're a student organization on campus. We have coffee breaks every Friday, and when we don't have coffee breaks, we're having teach-ins, as one will watch today. And we have a reading group on Sundays in the library.
At the Nook.
Oh yeah, the coffee breaks are at the Nook usually when we have them. And when we have
every Friday.
12 every Friday. And when we have teach-ins or panels, which is the third thing we do, they're in the Student Center usually. Now and then they'll be in we had one in Agnes Arnold, with David Barsamian in the spring. Our reading group is every Sunday. It's MD Anderson. It's in 300G, so it's on the third floor in the library. And just a little bit about Platypus. Platypus is a project dedicated to restoring emancipatory politics. We published the Platypus Review, which I handed out some of these. And basically the kind of question we raised today is, what does it mean to be left in the present? And so we raised this question by looking at the history of the left over the 20th century. But we also go back to its emergence in the 18th century. So as some of the reading group participants know, we've been dealing with Rousseau and Adam Smith, and they'll be getting Kant and Hegel before getting to Marx in the coming few weeks. So Michael Woodson has been participating in this chapter for, let's say, 3 years now. I think over 3 years now. Mm-hmm. And he's a Platypus member as well. And he's going to be presenting today on a sort of central theme, actually, in our fall syllabus, which is capital in history. So what does history mean, and is Marx even relevant? So when you're ready.
Good. Thanks, Danny. And I want to thank Danny for helping me with the presentation, as well as I referenced Chris Cutrone, who is a founding member, and one of the old members, Aaron Haygood, who I studied, and I just want you to know that if you don't like this presentation, it's their fault.
Okay.
And anyway, I'm going to be covering roughly what you see here on this handout, Capital and History, which is a Cutrone publication, I think, a Platypus publication. And in short, it follows a timeline that I guess looks at human history in three epochs. And I want to, of course, delve into the third epoch to talk about capital, which is sort of a special condition of the modern epoch or era. So anyway, I also want to cover capital since 1830 a little bit. I can't really cover that much, but I would like to point out that since Marx, capital has had a history, and I get that from an article by Cutrone called Symptomology,
which is in the Platypus Review. Yes.
So, then I would like this to be somewhat informal. I think I'll try to keep it to 1 hour. We'll try to finish at 1 o'clock. Aaron has to leave at 1, so we can take as long as you'd like. But I would say that anytime you want to jump in and say something, expand points, ask questions, please do it to teach in, not really a lecture. So feel free to do that. And with that, I'll sort of get going. Let's just start with the subtitle. Is Marx relevant? So the answer is yes, and it's yes because I Googled Marx, and in August there was a major article in the New York Times, and then Fox News. I Googled Marx and the New York Times, and then I Googled Marx and Fox News, and it came up 18 minutes ago.
What about this teaching?
Not quite. We don't watch Marxist news programming, is what it said. Anyway, so I mean, is Marx still relevant? Let's see, there's Piketty, is that his name, has a book coming out called a revision of his Capital in the 21st Century, which is called Capital and Ideology. When we hear ideology, we hear Marx, Marxism, I think, then what other, like it is relevant is my point. Even yesterday I was at KPFT doing the boards for a radio show called Living Art, and I was explaining to somebody about how my show got moved to the 6 a.m. It's an art show. And he said, why did you get moved at 6 a.m.? And I said, because I tried to oust the manager. He was too much of a Democrat. And he says, you're to the left of Marx, So he said, I wasn't telling him I had this presentation. He used the word, and I pointed it out, and you get the normal kind of reaction when you start talking about Marx seriously, which, on the way here, Rush Limbaugh called Bernie Sanders a Marxist. I mean, is Marx relevant? He's certainly still in the air. Do people understand him? That's a whole different question. Okay, but I'd like to think he's relevant, and that's that. Okay, so starting this presentation, it is customary to read this passage from the Grundrisse. So, Grundrisse. So this is Aaron's task.
Okay. Thus the old view in which the human being appears as the aim of production regardless of his limited national, religious, political character seems to be very lofty when contrasted to the modern world, where production appears as the aim of mankind and wealth as the aim of production. In fact, however, when the limited bourgeois form is stripped away, what is wealth other than the universality of individual needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc., created through universal exchange? The full development of human mastery over the forces of nature, those of a so-called nature, as well as humanity's own nature, the absolute working out of his creative potentialities, with no presupposition other than the previous historic development, which makes this totality of development, i.e., the development of all human powers as such the end in itself, not as measured on a predetermined yardstick, where he does not reproduce himself in one specificity, but produces his totality, strives to not to remain something he has become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. In bourgeois economics, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete working out of human content appears as a complete emptying out, this universal objectification, as total alienation, and the tearing down of all limited one-sided aims, as sacrifice to the human end in itself, to an entirely external end. This is why the childish world of antiquity appears on one side as loftier. On the other side, it really is loftier in all manners, where close shapes, forms, and given limits are sought for. It is satisfaction from a limited standpoint, while the modern gives no satisfaction, or where it appears satisfied with itself. It is vulgar, from Marxist Grundrisse, 1858.
All right, so to simplify this for my purposes, you can see that Marx is making a few core points. One, that modernity is new, qualitatively new. So we'll be talking about civilization, traditional civilization, and then modern civilization. And then secondly, that freedom is the anchor of this new world, this new change in human history. And then finally, something is very, very wrong with it, because he says at the end, that basically where it appears satisfied, it's vulgar. In other words, we're not attaining to some sort of world that is satisfactory. Capitalism is the crisis.
So why does he contrast it with the ancient world then?
The ancient world is a fixed world, a world of being and a different kind of freedom would be my answer to that. That the ancient world determines what people are based on their roles. So you're like a farmer or a peasant or a senator in Rome or something like that, and you are fixed in that particular role. But the modern era gives us the task of becoming more than what we are born into. Is that what you're?
So it can look like it's more fulfilling in a romantic way.
Yes, he makes
Right.
that point.
So he says childish at one time. He says we're kind of delighted in that they seem to have meaning in their life, whereas we kind of lack that.
Bourgeois right kind of like created a new form of anxiety that makes prior society look more attractive, I guess you could say.
Right.
I mean, I just think of Homer's epic heroes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they seem complete and marvelous and that kind of thing.
Right.
Maybe we don't have that for ourselves.
Yeah, so we seem to suffer from something that ancient civilization didn't suffer from. We have a kind of open-endedness or freedom that's almost dizzying in a way. So, Marx is saying in that passage, right, when he's saying, okay, if you get rid of money and profit and stuff, what's really behind it? Freedom. But it appears to us in this, unfree fashion, right? Base, I think he uses, and vile.
Mm-hmm.
And so thus, people look to the past like, oh, I wish I lived in ancient Greece and then I wouldn't have to worry about this. But it's like a vain desire, right? Because, you can't live in ancient Greece anymore.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Excellent.
And even you get that in the modern era.
Yeah.
People like romanticize about like the 80s and the 60s. And
Sure. Yeah.
The good old days.
Of the 80s.
Or the end of the century, the fin de siècle.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're talking about nostalgia, that people are always thinking that their current age is not what it could be and not as good as it was.
Right. And so he's giving, it's symptomatic. It's not just, I don't know, humans are always going to be nostalgic. He's saying, no, this is symptomatic of capitalism, is that people end up being nostalgic. Yeah.
Good point. I have to keep that one in mind for sure. All right. I'd like to point out that capitalism is the crisis, and I think most of us are trained to assume that capitalism is the enemy. If we're here, probably we all understand that. It's the greedy capitalists who are destroying the planet with their pollution and their greed and all of that. Which you could take that up, but the thing. One of the points that I came across is like there's some good that comes out of capitalism, or there's some positive stuff like antibacterial soap, and so I just wanted to kind of point that out. Like we went to the moon, right? Some pretty cool achievements, but then you have like Auschwitz and Hiroshima and stuff like that, and you really can't answer to the what Hegel called the slaughter bench of history. So. Something is very, very wrong, but again, we don't want to demonize the energy that is capitalism. Okay. And now let's go to the different epochs. First of all, the idea of an epoch. Now, Marx used the word cosmos one time, and I think he was referring to England and the Bourgeois Revolution, and I like that word because to me it's sort of like a worldview, or like how you understand things, right? So when we're talking about these different epochs, they're different ages or phases of human history, and of course you don't understand the epoch you're in, so it's not like hunter-gatherers or that the agrarians even understood themselves as an epoch, but what we're saying is there's a certain worldview, that we can identify as it relates to these three periods. And the third epoch is going to be the Bourgeois Revolution, and capitalism is part of the third epoch. All right. So we'll talk about the hunter-gatherers. If you look at the handout that I gave you, you'll see we've got hunter-gatherers first, and it's at the bottom. Then you have the peasants, and you have the third estate. And that's pretty much the outline for what I'm going to have to say. So The hunter-gatherers were nomadic people who roamed the earth prior to 10,000 BC. That's just set a date. You can add 5,000 if you want, or 15,000. What does it really matter? But I'd just say that we can only imagine what their life was like, and I would imagine that they kind of lived by rules like might makes right. To the swift goes the prey. You snooze, you lose is one way we'd say it, right? And these kinds of rules, and so they didn't relate to each other. And we imagine, there's no record, right? Maybe there's some arrowheads and stuff like that. But the point is that civilization is written record, right? So as we talk about the hunter-gatherers, you only know that they existed, and you can only imagine what they were, and we imagine that they lived for and by like immediate responses. All right, and then there's a great little quote from Rousseau that I want to read, which talks about the dawn of civilization. So the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in imagining the dawn of civilization, wrote this. See if I can read it. It's old English translation of old French or something, but anyway. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. So the first guy who said, "This is my farm," right? From how many crimes, wars and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not any one have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all of us and the earth itself to nobody," right? So that's Rousseau's imagination of hunter-gatherer turned into agrarian civilization. So we're going to set aside his cynicism and just think about that idea that somebody sat down, planted a stake, settled themselves on land. And I think that you see this happening around 10,000 BC across the planet, right? In China, Africa, the Aztecs and Aztec civilization in Americas, like things seemed like across the planet started to get recorded. So that's the beginning of civilization. Now I want to go into the state of being, which is important, and it's a little bit of a shift, but go ahead.
I guess, so the rest of the Rousseau paragraph, like the next two sentences after that, he says, "But how much humanity must have developed until we got to such a situation of property." So when going from the hunter-gatherer, this kind of prehistorical period, this is called the Neolithic Revolution, right? So agriculture and husbandry, that it was a qualitative change in humanity already, right? Maybe us running around, like when Stephen Hawking says we're just like slightly intelligent apes, that's true biologically still. But the point is that the founding of civilization actually already created what we refer to as human. That it created something new.
Certainly.
Yeah.
To be able to be a hunter-gatherer and put a stake and tell people, "This is my property,"
Right.
that presupposes language.
Yeah.
That presupposes a notion of laws, which are all products of a society.
Right.
So the only way this Neolithic property could come about is if the society was already there. The association was already there.
In other words, the person that Rousseau is characterizing who says, "Don't trust this person," is already presupposing society and having a language to communicate to them. Right? So language is already presupposing society. So, I guess the point there is that the Neolithic Revolution is already, it's like the birth of human from Homo sapien. It already creates this new thing. But then you're going to bring up the question of being, freedom to being.
Right. It also reminds me of the passage in Rousseau where he's talking about a person who's fashioning something, working on something, call it an arrowhead, and then he or she looks up and sees the same thing across a field where the person busy in the production of what he's working on recognizes that other person is producing something. And that's kind of what you're getting at. Like, who could say the mystery of what it is to gain consciousness, right? But
Sure.
it's seeing yourself in somebody else, and of course that's linked to society. Yeah. Okay, being. All right. In traditional civilization, the aim of humanity was being, and this is kind of referring back to the Grundrisse. Each person had a set identity, and you knew who you were and what you were supposed to do in this fixed state. You were born into a role: a serf, a blacksmith, a landowner, a knight. For them, freedom meant simply to be who you are, the serf or the nobleman, to exist in the place you were born to be. And from our point of view, their aim as producers were simply to reproduce their own world order. Man was the aim of production. All the practices of work and relations were aimed at producing humanity as it existed and was determined, decreed, and ordered to be. So as we look at this, it looks like a limited kind of being. So that, from our point of view, it looks fixed and closed. The freedom, their idea of freedom seems fixed and closed. And then we're kind of getting off the story, so I can unpack these ideas of being and becoming. So in the modern sense of things, humans became transformative, and you get a new concept of freedom. So instead of just being who you were born to be, you now are fixed in a state where you are free to determine yourself. And I guess it's said in this way, if I could say it right, the aim of humans become to produce. We become the producer. Where in the ancient world, the point of producing was to maintain your own fixed state of being. So the aim of the ancient human was to produce the state of being human, where now the point is that we're human to produce, which opens up some notions of freedom.
So freedom to be and freedom to become.
Right.
So the ancients had an idea of freedom to be. You were born a Jew, freedom to be a Jew, right? When I was raised Jewish, so I used to hear every Passover, let my people go. Right? This is the ancient idea of freedom, right? To be and reproduce one's identity. And in modernity, we have the question of freedom to become, which is what everyone in college is doing right now, which is, what shall I do with my life? How will I change the world? How will I move it forward? Right? I'm not going to be like my parents. I'm actually going to change things. It's going to be different. It's going to be better. The world's going to be more free after me, which is something that might have even been horrifying to ancients, where it's like, oh, you were born a Jew and you're going to go convert to another religion, right? They chopped people's heads off for that. So what you're getting at is that there's been a qualitative change in how we even understand freedom.
Right.
Right.
And even in the sense, I guess you could say that the sort of like early form of bourgeois right existed as a sort of ability of monarchs and lords and landowners. I mean, those who were not they in a sense kind of had their own sense of freedom to do whatever, and I guess like the Bourgeois Revolution was a kind of like broadcasting of it to greater society.
Yeah, it was ancient societies looked like they revolved around kings and queens, whereas in modernity, we know everybody to be free. And it's a crime, right? Like when we look at slavery, we go, that's wrong. That's incorrect. One ought not to be enslaved. Whereas in traditional society, one ought to be enslaved, right? I mean, slaves fought to retain their slavery because it would have been a disruption to the order.
I mean, the point you make sometimes in our reading group is that if you were a free person who was recently freed and you had no role, but a slave did, and so you were kind of at a disadvantage if you were free because you had to go out and find whatever it is you were going to do, which wasn't fixed, right? But a slave knew who they were.
History hitherto is a history of class struggles. Freemen and slaves,
Right.
because the freemen couldn't do the work that the slaves did, and so they just had to flee Rome.
And I think this is the reason why Marx talks about the melancholy of the old age. Because if you, when in the old society, when you had the freedom to be who you are, such as you were born at night, you're going to be at night. You were born a carpenter, you're going to be a carpenter. And there was some sense of relief and comfort in knowing what your role was, to simply reproduce this life. But with modernity, it begets the question, what do I do? And so there's this new founded freedom that comes with this anxiety, this melancholy for comfort of the old days, where you knew what your role was.
Yeah, unemployment, for example. Yeah. I mean, it's all real, isn't it? Even I'm on like a year-to-year contract.
Yeah.
And if I weren't, it's a right-to-work state, right? I mean,
You have the right to work, but there's no work.
That gets you to the core, doesn't it? I mean, it's like
Certainly.
you can be as out there as you want to be, but when you think about the difference between the money you have and an economy, you know, that the idea that you're going to have a paycheck coming in every 2 weeks, you know, yeah. It's nice at that point. It's nice to say, I know that I'm going to be, what are you going to be, a policeman, and every year I'll make $60,000 a year, and that's who I am, and you know, sort of a comfort in that. But you know.
Well, it's also that question just wasn't asked for them. So that's why, Marx is saying it's vain. It's kind of like we delight in it. In other words, it's not like those existential questions didn't exist in traditional society. And so it wasn't even there, whereas the point is that we're actually suffering from a freedom question. Right?
Yeah, it like, I guess like the whole romantic thing is, it's at odds. It's like, I guess a sort of betrayal of the human condition, I guess you could say, in that past society was unthinking. It was unable to live itself to some sort of like new potential.
Yeah, Erin Haygood just used the word unemployment when she talked about capitalism, and that's kind of why I brought it up. I think it's, anyway, maybe we'll get back to that. I should be talking about the bourgeois condition before we get into capitalism, but there's a discontent is kind of the point, and it's not just, or Ed called it an anxiety, it's not just, personal or something like that is for you and your therapist. I mean, obviously, a paycheck is more than just anxiety, right? Okay, so we're talking about the Bourgeois Revolution now, moving from traditional, pivoting a little bit. I'll make something clear about traditional civilizations, but I'm going to go to Adam Smith and Abby Sieyès and the Third Estate. So, traditional civilizations, later days in Europe, was comprised of a hierarchical social structure. So I don't know if I made this clear or if it's coming up soon, but let me just say while I'm here now, my thoughts. What you have is a condition of like the nobles and the clerics or the priests, and then you have different orders that sort of fall beneath them. So you're talking about a great chain of being, and it's the idea that you start with God. It's the worldview, the traditional worldview that start with God, angels, humans, animals, plants, and then within. I actually had a teacher who believed in angels. It took me my junior year of college, but I was over at St. Thomas, and he started talking about angels, and I just never thought anybody really, and he was just like, he was going to fail me if I didn't say I believed in angels. That's how strong, So anyway, I'm pretty clear on the great chain of being because
we have not overcome feudalism.
yeah, because I went to St. Thomas. But anyway, and then within society you have the clerics and the kings, and you have the various orders, but it goes to the let's say the serfs and the slaves, that kind of thing. So I guess we're kind of looking at Europe, but if you look, I imagine if you study this thing planet-wide, you'd see it's pretty true. Okay, so that's the traditional civilization. All right, and then we're going to the Bourgeois Revolution, which is what I call modernity. So Adam Smith's book, Wealth of Nations, Book 3, Chapter 3, talks about the rise and progress of the cities and how population started to migrate to the towns. So I'm going now to explain this transition from traditional civilization to modernity. All right. So I'm using Smith to get there because I just love this passage. So he's speculating on the early burghers, who are the urban people, or the people who came from the country to the city, right? And he's making a point that they really don't have a place, and that they teamed up with the sovereigns. And the interesting thing is, he's saying that they actually worked with the sovereigns to push out the nobles. All right, so this is the quote. He writes, it seems strange that sovereigns should have abandoned the prospect of increased revenue and have erected independent republics. In this erecting independent republics, I believe refers to their in opposition to the lords and the barons. But the towns were the natural allies of the sovereigns to the lords. In other words, the sovereigns, the king, teamed up with the burghers against the lords, which I think is really fascinating, and I never learned that at St. Thomas. I learned about angels, but I love my alma mater, don't get me wrong, but the point being, you don't think of that very much, you don't hear about it, but that's sort of the interesting look at how we got from traditional civilization to modernity, right? People moved to the city, and things were such that it fostered change. And bourgeois society comes from the word burgher, and that has to do with the city.
So how is the countryside different than the city?
Was it the agrarian? I guess I didn't talk much about farmers and pastoral settings, but the traditional structure is based on lands, right? The lords had lands and had peasants on the lands, and sharecroppers and serfs and all this stuff, right? So there was already a fixed structure of in traditional society, and I can't really say I have in mind what made the move towards the city, but there was a move towards the city. Yeah.
So we can kind of imagine perhaps the agriculture or the countryside still living within the framework of feudal society. And so it's perfectly normal in feudal society to have slaves and serfs tied to your land.
Right.
And so eventually, some of these people are going to get tired of being exploited, and they're going to make a run for it.
Mm-hmm.
So if the country is everywhere, where do you run to? The cities. And so slaves flock to the cities start to grow. And so I think that's one of the qualitative differences, in that the countryside still had this old world view, whereas the cities were becoming something new. A new phenomenon was rising there, a new people, the burghers,
the laborers,
the
too.
bourgeois. Exactly.
And the tradesmen, right?
Well, yeah, and this brings up the second point, whereas in the countryside with all this old world view, you were a farmer, you farmed, your son was going to farm, you were a carpenter, they were going to carpentry. But if you were a slave who just escaped in the city, well, you can't farm, you have no wares, no commodities. What do? You sell your labor.
Mm-hmm.
I'll work for you for so much, and I can get food, I can get hustle. And so that was something that was qualitatively different. You didn't need titles, you didn't need lands. All you needed was yourself, your work. And so that's one of the differences between the countryside and the city that arose.
It's literally a new property altogether. Yeah, because they didn't have property. So they had property and labor instead. So a lot of these cities were, with the decline of the Roman Empire, they were just like ghost towns, because manufacturing was kind of looked down upon in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It was looked like it's speculation and it's trading. It's any of the pejoratives people would have about Wall Street. They already made them. Aristotle already made them about manufacturing. So these professions were taken up because they were looked down upon. And then they started to produce tools that the countryside needed. And so commerce develops and the cities start to become wealthy. But no, this is an important point here, because when Marx says bourgeois, he just means urban. People think it means like, I don't know,
Dirty.
wealthy
Fat
or
cat.
something. It just means urban.
Pompous.
So the proletariat is bourgeois. That's the point.
Things you learn, right?
Not at St. Thomas. When
That's right. Not at St. Thomas. Speaking of popes, then basically that's why we celebrate the French Revolution, or why the French Revolution is so important, and why you don't get, you don't see that same kind of celebration of 1776 as you do 1789, because like the French Revolution was consciously like, that's enough of the old order, and it was a conscious revolution against king and pope. So this evolved into our modern epoch. Obviously, we do not answer to kings and popes any longer. We rebelled against them, and we based our human values on productivity. Production became the aim of humans. I want to talk about that more in a minute. But in bourgeois or modern society, freedom has the connotation of what ought to be, and we recognize this transformation in human relations, as did Abbé Sieyès, who wrote The Third Estate, which I think really makes clear, what's happening during this time. He called the rise of the bourgeois society a revolt of the Third Estate, of humanity as an efficient maker against two estates of the traditional civilization, the estate being the priests, the Pope, and the warriors. So we could talk about Homo faber, which is, man. I hate to use the word man. I know that's totally chauvinistic.
human producer.
The human as maker and the human as efficient maker. And I don't know if you want to talk about that. I was going to.
Well, yes, you brought up the estates, and you can see right there that's another way of the whole transformation, which is, why did the estates exist? Well, the rulers had to justify themselves as being with, hearing the word of God, right? So why do we rule? Because, God speaks to me.
That's the divine rights of kings.
The
He
divine
is the
rights,
representative of God.
Or it's also that you know the mysteries, meaning you know how to read Latin,
Right.
and know how to
Make the body and blood into God.
Right.
The bread and wine into body and blood.
And so the serfs are dependent on you for religious instruction, and the knights are the ones with honor, right? So you're a descendant of somebody who conquered that land. Meaning, like, property used to just be, oh, we conquered this land, and you're a descendant, and that's it. And that was right. It was like, that's, whereas today people go, that's my money, I worked for it. That's a modern thing.
Right.
That's very modern. Most of human civilization is, no, we defeated you in battle thousands of years ago, and that's why you pay me taxes.
Might makes right.
Right. So I think, the Abbé Sieyès, who we're going to be reading him in 2 weeks, he says, who are we? We're just people that were conquered by the Franks. Like, that's it. And then he calls them villains, which was like scandalous, because villains are people that run away to the cities. And he goes, no, you're the real villains, because you're not part of the nation, you just conquer people or something like that. So a lot of discontents that people have with capitalists today, when we go, they don't work for anything. These are just standard bourgeois discontents. That's what the serfs said to the Lord. You didn't work for that. You just take my money. Screw you. I don't know if I can curse on record. So, the estates then, the third estate is what was called the people who produce. And at the time, that just meant anybody. It meant everything from the bankers down to someone who works at Kroger.
So I'm on thin ice, but it seems to me we're talking about the value theory of production. Is that how you put it? Like
labor theory of value?
Yeah.
Labor theory of value?
What counts as being productive?
Like you can tell I'm so puzzling over that. The labor theory of value, what do we consider good? Well, production, as opposed to, being virtuous or like something like that,
Being
right?
free.
Kind of interesting.
Or being free.
Being free, right? So anyway, production became
people
the
kind
highest.
of reproduce themselves through production, and that's kind of what makes it, I guess, in a way, satisfying.
Yeah, production becomes the highest order.
Yeah, because it used to be those who produce work in the fields, and they're profane, right?
Yes.
That's the sin because Adam ate the apple, and so you have to labor. That's the profane realm.
Right.
That's not the realm of honor and virtue. It's the people who don't do that.
So the third estate turned that on its head.
Turned it on its head and said, well, actually, the priests are just lazy,
We don't need you anymore.
and the knights are just a bunch of landlords.
Right.
So we don't read them anymore, unfortunately, but Nietzsche, the transvaluation of values, what used to be bad became good, which is to work was a virtue now. Whereas it used to be, no, that's what like the common folk do, is they get their hands dirty in the field.
I have a question. So we're talking about 18th century, right? And then we're trying to relate with it now. So I don't get. We're only seems to me we're only talking about the European and the Roman Empire and the Greeks and stuff.
Eurocentric.
But there's more than that in the world. What's their impact? Like, what's the Asian empire's impact? Because when we say that, okay, it's the religion, because like God was talking to them and stuff, like the kings and the whatever and the higher. Sorry, never mind. You get what I mean.
Yeah.
But in the Asia, it wasn't like that. It wasn't God. It was just like, okay, this dude is strong, just like protect us. And then there was like nomads. That's how you pronounce it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like the Turkic nomads. They will just settle and then settle somewhere else, and then it was just fights, against it. That's their land. And it's not like, oh, God is talking to him. It's like, just gonna kick our ass,
Right.
kind of stuff.
Well,
What's that kind of culture's impact on now? Or like, how did it contribute to the nowadays society? Or is it only, are we just like living the European culture right now only? Like,
Excellent question.
You see the same patterns from in the West, in the East too. So in China, they had this kind of concept of the mandate of heaven, and so the emperor was essentially considered this divine being. In Japan, they considered, or since like it's the first emperor Jimmu, they considered him a god. And so, and Genghis Khan, he was like the Oceanic Kagan, and he, like this sort of like representative of, I guess.
yeah, but he was also part of a nomad once. It's just like a grown nomad. It's like Turkics become an Ottoman Empire. They were nomad ones too. So how is that related with God again? Like they became like that. They weren't like
Yes.
originally like that.
They justified it like that. Like in
Yeah.
other words, the Christians as well were at one time just a rebellion
Mhm.
in ancient Rome. Like they were revolutionaries.
They were
and so
terrorists.
They were
I don't-
considered terrorists. And,
Yeah.
no, like for real, they were.
Mhm.
That's why it was the rebellion of, you Romans, like sodomy is like, this sin today. Well, that's because the Romans engaged in sodomy. So the Christians were like, no, that's wrong. That's bad. And so they rebelled against such things. So, I mean, after people conquered things, they then justify things as, well, I am God, or I am the divine order of God.
You had to have somebody to try to claim something in order for them to become a king or whatever. And then after the fact, when I guess as a means of, well, maybe not a conscious means of like repressing any sort of like bourgeois sense,
But it was also in a sense that
but
it will just like marry rich people's daughters, and then it will grow and grow and grow,
Yeah.
and it will become an empire or whatever.
Mhm.
It wasn't like like it wasn't because they were like really, like they had the authority. It's just like happened to be like that.
Yeah.
Because they were smart. They were just like playing games to like get more land and like more authority and the geography. So why it confuses me is like when you hear the European history in here, and then when I heard when I took the history and I like learned in the Middle East or the
Very cool. Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
their history sense and now what I'm hearing is so different. Like it seems to me like we are now just living European history. It's like even the other like history parts, like the other world's history is not even relevant now. It's like I don't know.
So let me say something about the seeming Eurocentrism. So the first thing is that I don't know if I would identify bourgeois society with Eurocentrism because, of course, most of Europe tried to kill bourgeois society for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So it emerged, yes, in like England and towns of Germany and parts of France, but when we say it looks like European history, well, European history was like Rome and the medieval ages and the lords and Carthage shall burn, right? This is what was considered European history. And in the sort of bourgeois era when it's emerging, we were getting this from Adam Smith, but also people he knows at the time like Abby Raynell, they're like, well, what if Carthage had not burned? Maybe we could have avoided all of the, tomfoolery of the medieval ages.
Yeah, the Dark
Of all this like crazy stuff of like, this priest who's saying I have to do all these things and all the marriage, court stuff that's happening as well. I'm going to send my daughter away to get married in order to get property. Like, for real. Yeah, of course that's what's happening. That's what marriage is. It's just an exchange for property. So it's still true. It's of course still true. In terms of the Eurocentrism, it's rather that bourgeois society transformed the world. And so the famous phrases from the Communist Manifesto is the most revolutionary thing in history has been the bourgeoisie. Not because they wanted to do so. Like if I went back in time and met Mr. Bourgeois and said, are you a revolutionary? He's like, no, I'm just trying to make money, right? I'm just trying to make as much money as possible. And guess what? That was transformed humanity qualitatively. It revolutionized everything, right? This is why they mention in the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. And so the different parts of the world have actually become bourgeoisified and have been bourgeoisified. I mean, especially in terms of the East and the Middle East, well, these have been trading areas. And so they were probably the first people to come into contact with the bourgeoisie rather than, some feudal lords who were like, let's send the Crusades down there because those people are not Christian, right? Like, so actually the bourgeois were probably more receptive to different kinds of cultures and religions than the, Christendom in Europe. So in terms of like Eurocentrism, it's true that bourgeois society originates, literally a society originates in Europe, but it's transformed the world completely, especially by now in 2019. Like it had qualitatively transformed everything. By the French Revolution, I mean already, the French Revolution is already bringing in England and, America's, it's already the world is involved in such because money relates to everything.
I mean, and I think it's a good question because you're asking like who's telling the story or something, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's not our question and maybe we could look back at ourselves with it because clearly like you had like the Silk Road and you had like Constantinople and all, they were key, right? And,
Yes.
And in a way they were part of this whole thing that we're isolating to a date on a timeline.
I mean, even independently from like Eurasia, I mean, you had like Native Americans in like New England. They had started like the concept of a bourgeois society, like the Iroquois Confederacy.
That's
Right.
Yeah, but then there was colonization.
Yeah.
And they
So we don't.
Converted.
So that story gets killed off. Yeah, but
So everyone should come to our reading group on Sunday when Adam Smith directly deals with the colonization question.
Yeah.
And I want to let you were saying. I want to let you.
Oh, well, I'm an anthropology major,
Yeah.
so I like where you're going. I'm just thinking about how we do see, because like people had just recently immigrated to what we call the Americas, and they're starting to build this society that does start to take this pattern that we see that had been happening hundreds of years before in Europe and Asia, and then colonization happens, and they come in, the colonizers come in, they exploit the land, they
It's like the Dark
kill
Ages.
off the people, and they institute so anything that it was just killed, just literally killed.
A different society was wiped out.
Yes.
What societies are we talking about?
I'm not super well versed on it. We know that the Aztec Empire was
Americas.
massive,
The Incas.
huge. And then we know that there was I cannot think of what it is called. Catalahoyuk? I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's in
That's what this is
like
about.
it's in
We're learning to
Missouri
talk
area.
here, right?
Missouri area.
Honestly.
Just massive hub of
Yeah.
capitalism, trade, through in between the tribes.
So, this reading group this Sunday is literally Adam Smith on the colonies, so this is why it's a perfect thing in a sense. And I like how Adam Smith talks about it, which I think kind of puts the whole question of history, of what's the meaning of anything. Is this all stupidity? You mentioned the slaughter bench of history. This is the Hegel thing we're going to read in a few weeks. So Adam Smith is like, well, why did Europeans come to America? They thought there was El Dorado, and they just ran around the continent killing people, looking for something that didn't exist. And he
Not
goes,
only that, but
Yeah.
Europe was falling apart at the time
Yes.
that they were coming to America. It was like Trump called African countries shithole countries. That was literally like Europe
Sure.
at that time.
yes,
Just completely falling apart. Disease, desolate. They were running out of resources. They had expanded quicker than they could sustain themselves, and they went out venturing. It's very different than the story that we get about the Pilgrims, but that's really, it was economically driven.
so
Interesting.
let me just finish with the Adam Smith
Yeah,
point
sorry.
to relate it all in. Okay, so he goes, yeah, well, why did they run around? They just ran around seeking for gold, and it was a bunch of dum-dums, and, they think there's all this stuff here. And he goes, and America had also been colonized by different Spain had come over, and Spain just brought feudalism, right? In other words, there's also, I can't find it, but I know it's a lecture that Engels gave somewhere, where he goes, for like a century when Spain was here, just nothing happened. Like, yeah, they killed people, but there was no development of society or anything like that. When random English people came over, not thinking of anything like I'm going to bring whatever, they brought bourgeois right. They brought a different kind of property. And so the way that kind of Adam Smith puts it is that a lot of innocent natives have been killed, right? Killed in the Americas, obviously. This is Adam Smith. And he goes, but perhaps bourgeois right will allow them to develop in such a way so as to fight off their captors, to actually fight off Europe and actually gain the respect such that they will be treated as sovereign nations. So Adam Smith is directly saying, it's totally possible that the indigenous people should and ought to fight off the Europeans and gain he calls it mutual respect, such as to enter into commerce. So it's one of these things. I mean, this is something that we deal with a lot.
I have to go.
You gotta go? Okay.
Good luck with the physics.
Yeah, Aaron, sorry, physics is interrupting capitalism.
Unfortunately.
Okay,
Thanks
so
for coming.
Call it gravity or
I
something.
just
Yeah.
want to make the point that, like, Aaron and y'all coming makes Marx relevant.
Yes,
the bottom
yeah.
line, right?
So the point being that all of human history is a lot of, for the bourgeoisie at the time during this Enlightenment, looks like silly. It's like we enter into civilization. Why? Probably because people just enslaved each other. Really? It's like, okay, some people had property and they just conquered people and enslaved somebody. That's probably the first kings, and then they called themselves gods. And we kind of went through all sorts of wars and conquests, and for religious reasons, we sent people for decades going into these crusades to go and conquer people because they have some other arbitrary religion than ours.
Still going on in that room.
Still going on in that room right now. It's goes
Have
great.
you guys seen it?
What's going on in
It's a
there?
mission trip.
There we go.
Meeting in there.
See
A
that?
mission.
Born again people?
Yeah. See, we've not overcome traditional society. That's right. This is capitalism brings all the old forms back into existence. And so they're asking, is there any meaning to human history at all? Or to raise the Rousseau thing, ought we not go back into the forest and eat acorns and forget this ever happened? That human civilization is a mistake. And so the whole Adam Smith point is, how do we redeem nihilism? This is why he says, no, he doesn't say Europe has birthed this amazing civilization in America. He says, despite them. Despite their folly and stuff, they arbitrarily created a possibility, to quote Thomas Paine, to start over and not have a civilization based on slavery, but based on free. And this is Adam Smith's speculation that this ought to be the case and we ought to fight for this. And, he really says, at his time in history, slavery is everywhere in the world but England. That's what he mentions in his lectures at one time. And he just goes, this is the best opportunity for overcoming it, right? It's easy to say in 2019, oh, that's wrong, but we have 2020, hindsight is 2020 vision. And so what the bourgeoisie raised, the radical ones, let's not say the conservative ones or the ones who accommodated, was how do we redeem human history? Is it just a slaughter bench of everyone's just being thrown into this meat grinder of coming in and out of history arbitrarily? Or is there a purpose to this? Could we make a purpose to this? And so they're saying, there are these possibilities for freedom, and we ought to take them up. It's maybe the one meaning in life we have.
I know a Christian once said that if you study Marx, you're letting the devil in. And so we're right at the crux, you know what I'm saying? It's like, we're talking like maybe we can survive this thing.
But it's not even at Marx yet.
And then the traditional one is, you better obey. Marx is the devil. So anyway.
Well, but that's not even at Marx yet. It's Adam Smith too. In
Right.
other words, we're still tasked with Adam Smith today. Okay, I don't know, there's random, maybe Trump will send another cruise missile into Syria, right? Obviously we haven't achieved, some kind of cooperative, voluntary, cosmopolitan society yet. Yeah.
On every level. Anytime you would really want to look at it, you could probably tear up about how bad things are anywhere you look, yeah.
But, that's the go for broke, the go for broke view of history that the Bourgeois Revolution raised. Is all of this a mistake, and how do we make it to not be the case? It's to realize this freedom. And so in terms of, yes, Europe has just colonized all of the world many times over, right? Colonize people and then send people to kill those colonized people to colonize it again, right? That's the American Revolution, right?
And then now we live with the consequences.
Certainly.
When we
Yeah.
bring up things like, why can't we have a better, society, or world even, a lot of conservative people will argue that we can't take care of the world. Just the poverty that they've created across the world is the result of this economic system of capitalism. And it's instead of being, just in little pockets of whether it's Europe or, Central America when the Aztecs were, it's worldwide.
It is, certainly.
Right.
It's,
If you simplify it, it's just a bunch of people who are annoyed by the rich kings and the landlords. They wanted to be like them, and then they tear them apart, and they're just playing the kings now.
Certainly.
It's so fucking funny. It's very childish. It's pathetic actually, and we're living in their ideals.
it's like kind of force.
Well, I think we should try to retain the question of possibilities, because, the cynicism would just make it look like, no, it is all a mistake. So in other words, in terms of Adam, today it looks like Adam Smith might apologize for things, but that's because we're seeing it from capitalism onto Adam Smith. Whereas, Smith is not trying to be cynical about things, which he obviously could have been. He could have been look, England. In some of his early lectures, he's like, I don't know if slavery is ever going to be abolished because the slave masters make the laws and they're never going to do anything else. He actually is I don't know if it's ever going to happen, right? Cross our fingers. Whereas he's going, if there's this possibility, then I'm going to throw my life into seeing the fullest potential that it has. Because, human history does look like it's just, we used to be ruled by King Charlemagne, and now we're ruled by King Trump or something. It's just different kings or something like that.
Now we have democracy, yeah.
Yeah.
Which
We have
brings us
King
to-
democracy.
We got to Adam Smith, but not capitalism. Shall I go on? It is
Yeah.
1 o'clock.
Yeah.
You all
Yeah.
Try to
good.
wrap it up.
Okay. So the Bourgeois Revolution happened, and then capitalism is the epoch to which Marx is referring to when he writes that it gives no satisfaction, or where it appears satisfied with itself, it is vulgar. So we live in capitalism. We've been, since the mid-19th century, Rosa Luxemburg dates it at 1830. Some event happened in 1830. But it is our cosmos, a sort of modernity that has gone wrong. So to summarize some of the things I've said, the modern era ushered in a qualitative change in the way humans interact with each other and understand ourselves, a world with a goal that is based on reason, that valorizes labor and productivity, a society of individuals living in equality with a freedom that is in concert with the interest held by society as a whole. So that's got a lot in it. I'll just leave it alone. But basically, we live in freedom. You have the idea of the importance of labor. You have rights, bourgeois rights, and that is what we're trying to attain to. That was the Bourgeois Revolution. If this revolution, so Marx witnessed this budding of the Bourgeois Revolution, and he saw something wrong with it. In short, he saw that the rights, the rights that we claim as modern humans, are in conflict with the forces of production. So society under the form of wage labor has established itself in a way that catastrophically undermines its best aims and purposes. So the Bourgeois Revolution is either incomplete or failed with the rise of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism.
So Marx, already with Adam Smith, the bourgeois society had been ongoing. So it's already a late reflection in a lot of ways,
We have to keep that in mind.
So Marx has seen what happens to the bourgeois revolution after the Industrial Revolution. So usually how the Industrial Revolution is taught is that, people discovered science somehow, like they discovered to use coal or steam power all of a sudden. But there's a famous way that Marx puts it in Capital, which is it's not the steam engine that creates the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution that creates the steam engine. Meaning all of those things are actually the effect, but they're taught as the cause. Because of course, Hero of Alexandria knew about steam engines and made little steam engine toys as well. So Capital then for Marx, the bourgeois revolution is still ongoing to this day. Right, it's still ongoing in Marx's time. And it develops a contradiction with its means. So you were talking about labor, and you brought up labor, that when the people ran into the city, they didn't have land, so the only property they had was their labor. It's what everybody in this room, by the way, affirms all the time when you say, I can't hit you. You say, that's my right. It's my inalienable right not to aggress on my property, which is your labor. Everybody in this room claims bourgeois right. Note to pen. Okay. So what happens after the Industrial Revolution is that right comes into contradiction with its development. And so
that's a complicated statement, right?
It's a complicated statement, but the easiest way in which it's expressed symptomatically, so you mentioned something Aaron mentioned earlier, is unemployment, which is, what is unemployment for bourgeois society? It means that you're not even human, because you're useless. And in bourgeois society, if you're useless, you're not human. Like literally, Adam Smith could not imagine that anyone could ever be useless, because the division of labor, you can always find a way to make yourself useful for the rest of society. So with unemployment, it's bourgeois society saying you're useless, not human, and so that's the symptomatic expression of what you were just saying, which is that the relations, labor, have come into contradiction with the development, the forces. And the expression of that is we actually overproduce laborers. We have too many laborers.
I think the point of technology is that technology wants to outperform labor, right? Creating an excess of labor, which is unemployment. So like I'm way on thin ice here, but it seems like Marx was saying like the very mechanisms of capitalism is undermining itself.
Certainly.
Yeah.
It's bringing these contradictions up to the surface.
In other words, you prize labor at the same time that you want to abolish it or something like that.
We read Adam Smith last week, right? And what does he say in that second chapter? He says, in a wealthy society, labor will be the most valued commodity. Now, when we read Marx in about a month, and he's writing in the manuscripts, he's going to say, we see that labor has become the most wretched of commodities. Mm-hmm. So after the Industrial Revolution, the whole point of bourgeois society has become the most useless thing.
Is it that simple? That jobs suck?
It's that simple that for John Locke, he's like, look, the more you work, the more property you have. And after the Industrial Revolution, the more you work, the less property you have.
You want to be productive and live, but for no good reason, some workers cannot find a living or have to kill themselves to work. Right?
Yeah. Because you know what's worse than being exploited in capitalism? Not being exploited in capitalism. That's the whole point. That's the Joan Robinson thing.
The Cambridge economist Joan Robinson famously said that the only thing worse than being exploited under capitalism is not being exploited under capitalism.
But so anyways, like people wonder, why is the bourgeois revolution still continuing? And I'm literally going through this right now because I'm on the job market. Because people want jobs to feed themselves. And that's enough of the reproduction of the contradiction. So the Industrial Revolution is like saying, no, we don't need that anymore. And people are like, I need to live. I need to put calories in my mouth so I can stay alive. And that's enough to create the contradiction right there.
Income is handy.
Yes, handy. It's like, so anyways, like this is something that the reason you have to read Smith and Kant and all these people is to realize what has changed since their time. In other words, Adam Smith is like, oh, the more division of labor, it's going to be, everyone's going to have a value in society.
Right.
That, it like inspired a lot of evolutionary biologists where it's like niches. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, everyone's going to have a point in society and a value in society. And now the division of labor is like the way of throwing people out of counting. Or making you...
Oh, sorry. That's another good point. Just the concept of evolutionary biology and how these ideas were really springing up during this time. The concept of like hierarchy, an evolutionary hierarchy where man is at the top and there's like lesser species. It plays a huge role in these kinds of thought processes. And just the idea that everyone fills a little niche in society and that you have to, and that there's got to be something that comes out of that niche that is valuable for the greater ecosystem, economy. Yeah,
these were revolutionary ideas back then.
And it just got twisted.
It's pseudoscience. It's just a.
Well,
that sort of does it for capitalism. I could talk about the two sides of the same coin and what happened to capitalism post Marx or something, but
it's 1:15, so
we can wrap it up.
Okay, I mean, I will sit around for discussion. I mean, we have this room. I'm not expecting people to stay here, but we have the room till 4, so it's not like we have to get out of here. Yeah. So
I'm good. Yeah. Well, shall we take a break or something? And those who want to quietly step aside, they can.
Step aside.
I'll come back.
And,
okay, we can take a break and then.
And I will talk about, and I'd like to get some thoughts on how capitalism and socialism have kind of run the same track, have run through history since 1860.
But I mean, other comments and questions. I mean, right now, because we just did a giant running leap from 10,000 years ago to 2019. So I mean.
And I was everywhere. I am sure.
Other comments.
Get me back on earth here.
Criticisms.
In the Grundis quote, that says, where it appears satisfied with itself, it is vulgar. Can y'all explain what vulgar means in that context, and what the opposite of it would be? What would be less vulgar satisfaction?
So where capitalism appears to be working, it's like the throwing people onto the streets for Like that's productivity, basically, is how it's being expressed in capitalism, is that we don't need you for that job anymore.
So like satisfaction or satisfied with itself. So the vulgar satisfaction would be just that the aims of productivity.
One way to also describe capitalism, I think this will highlight it, is that the means and the ends have become apparently separate. It's, like in other words, the point was to develop the potential for humanity. But now, we're thrown into jobs that are like really boring and seem useless. I used to work at a Bed Bath & Beyond, right? I've mentioned this to you guys maybe too many times. Fucking useless job. It's not like they literally, it's not like human civilization needed me to do this, or people are not gonna have vacuums or something like that. And, but that's like the functioning of the quote unquote system. So where it appears to work, it's like the most vulgar thing possible. And again, that section, so these are Marx's notebooks to himself, so it's not like a publication. He's saying that this is how the potential of humanity appears to us. So one can think of capitalism as we literally suffer from our potential freedom that has not been realized. I mean, I was just talking about people being thrown out of work. That actually ought to be a good thing. It ought to be the case that where it's like the Jetsons or something, like we only have to work like 30 minutes a week or something. So why do people overwork themselves today? Because they're still tied to this anachronistic social relation, which was labor, which, as you were discussing at one time, had an emancipatory potential, because it meant for the serf or the slave that they gained bodily autonomy, they gained the ability to go and do what they want and develop themselves. But it's now become obsolete. The Industrial Revolution, if I personify it, said, you don't need that anymore, and humanity said, no, we still need it. And so this is why it's a contradiction. It's not, and so as a consequence, we suffer from like freedom, whereas it ought to be emancipatory, but we suffer instead from humanity's potential.
Yeah, I don't think I covered the idea that we're trapped. Like capitalism has created a cosmos of our own making that we can't do anything about. So it's as simple as that Sorcerer's Apprentice story, you know that one?
Yeah,
where the sorcerer's apprentice creates this these things that like serve his interest, and then they get out of control and they take over.
We should watch that.
Yeah, his own.
When we do the Communist Manifesto, we should watch Fantasia, so we can watch Mickey Mouse play Goethe's Sorcerer's
Also,
Apprentice.
the monster at the end. I think that I've seen somebody write about how that's symbolic of something.
Oh, okay.
It's something Adorno related, I feel like.
Yeah, you guys know the Sorcerer's Apprentice story? Basically, it's an apprentice of the sorcerer learns some magic from the sorcerer that they ought not to know.
So he created something that would do his work for him.
Exactly.
Right.
There was something that you said that reminded me. I'm taking the disability intersections class this semester, and there's a lot of conversation about the way that capitalism shapes our view of people with disabilities.
Yeah.
It's not even like we view them because they can't produce. Some people physically can't produce any capital. We view them as less valuable people sometimes in society, and even for people who can still produce, just because they can't produce in the way that the system wants them to, like in a manufacturing line where you do this and you do that, well, maybe it would take them like a couple extra steps, or they would need to do it slightly differently, but it would require more time or accommodations to them. And so we just simply are just like, no.
It's
Yeah.
a great example where like the production is both valued and devalued at the same time, right? Because they should be able to just do whatever production and be, like Adam Smith's promise, to have purpose and be fulfilled, and yet they've got this other pressure on them.
Yeah, you have to do it this way. And if you have some kind of disability that keeps you from doing it exactly this way, even though you may be able to get to the end product still, because of time constraints, because of making sure that you do it fast enough and get those things out in the way that they want you to, they just say, no, you're not suited for this job.
This is Horkheimer's philosophy of the little man or whatever, where he talks about a guy who's unemployed, goes to his brother-in-law and says, "Can I have a job?" And the brother-in-law says, "Sorry, I don't have anything for you. The economy's bad." And it's like, how can that be an answer? We created economy. How can it be a problem?
Right. In Adam Smith's time, that would have not happened. It would have been, yeah. But no, this is an interesting point, which is that then they're. I was like, when you said this, I was thinking of when we read the critique of the Gotha program, that the first thing that would happen in like the dictatorship of the proletariat is we'd go, okay, we're going to compare two people's labors, but one person has maybe some natural endowment and somebody is disabled, and is this an appropriate standard? So it would immediately politicize labor as a property, which is that, well, no, maybe we think that the person who's disabled ought to have disability insurance and other kinds of welfare programs, or be allowed jobs where they can, feel useful without being, prohibited in a certain way, like in a factory job. It also raises the question as well with the factory job, which is that the Industrial Revolution also opened up the opportunity for those people counting as productive as everyone else. Meaning, the first thing that machines do is they ostensibly break the natural differences.
Yeah, and all you have to do is just stand there and
Right.
Sure.
do the thing.
But this actually goes to the point, which is that since you're just doing that, does labor seem to count then anymore?
And that's
Yeah.
is anyone could replace you.
Exactly.
And that when workers don't have that, if they're not providing something like very special, very specific, that strips them of their power in the workplace, where they can't bargain for better
Exactly.
environments,
And this is,
better
I
rights,
think-
because boss can just.
That's the Marx point, which is that rather than one person's labor counting as valuable as another person's labor, it's one person in time counts as much as another person in the same time. It's a reflection of the factory. The factory is already as communist as possible because it already makes everyone equal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is like the crux of like capitalism, or at least like modern capitalism,
Mhm.
because capitalism was the possibility of being emancipated, being able to go to a factory and be able to produce, be able to express yourself through your production by whatever you could produce. But something happened in history where we lost that idea that capitalism should make us more free, and that capitalism should be just for profit.
Yeah.
And
Or things.
It should be
Or
serving
things.
us.
Like in other words, or what's understood by freedom now is, and Evan, you might get this in whatever class you're in right now, which is freedom from, like it's a negative freedom. It's the Berlin kind of thing, which is there's like a positive liberty and a negative liberty. And so now when people talk about liberty, it's like, leave me alone. Whereas the freedom to be to freedom to become, which you were mentioning in your presentation, it was the freedom to develop oneself fully, which is also not positive freedom. It's not like, oh, give me, something from the state or something. But it's actually that the individual's freedom to become is linked up with the social freedom to become. And so our concepts of freedom today, very degraded. From Smith, from Kant.
I see like a lot of conservative understandings of freedom where that's just like
Right.
the state to shrink.
It's like an ancient conception of freedom,
Yeah.
right? It's like, let me just, it's not even about, well, how do you move the world forward? It's like, don't touch me. I don't know, which is like, fine, that's part of the freedom as well. But
That's why I started seeing a lot of like just thought now, since we started reading a lot. It's just like whether it's conservative or not. And what I started understanding conservative though is more it's just it's backward looking but not forward building. It looks back and it just wants to conserve old social orders and go back to the way things were, which is always impossible and always going to be, it's always going to be degrading. But it doesn't want to build anything. If it doesn't see any way of changing anything, it just sees it of conserving. Conservatism.
most anti-capitalism is conservative.
Yeah.
Probably all of it right now. In other words, it's like, this is why capitalism is bad. But the Marx task why he even, I mean, he never said capitalism, but why he even talked about it was that, no, this is the potential for greater freedom. You don't need Marx to tell you that your job sucks. You need to read Capital to know that your boss is like an asshole and, you know, makes more, you know, and probably their boss is an, you know, it's like the whole thing or something like that, or your job sucks or something like that. No, the whole point about Marx is, how does capitalism point beyond itself?
What possibilities does it bring us?
Yeah. That's why, you know, he talked about, you know, he's going to say scientific socialism versus utopian socialism. It means, what are the possibilities? Not, you know, doing statistics or something, which is what people think this. Statistical analysis. I mean, did you want to talk about the
different capitalism and socialism, right?
Sure.
So I want to briefly outline this, and I'm using Chris's symptomology.
Okay.
Is that what it's called? Essay. So we're talking about capital in history. So we got to Marx basically in the fundamental contradiction that he saw, and then from there you have the monopoly capitalism and the 19th century workers' movement, imperialism and the Second International, Ford Keynesianism, and the nationalistic communisms, in other words, communism in one country. Hang on, I'm going to let you just sort all this out in a minute.
No, I'm
and then neoliberalism and the new left. And so if you're looking at capital and history, you know, you've got these different phases. And what I'm starting to see in studying this stuff is like, look, you have one coin, it's capitalism and socialism. And so when you have imperialism, then you have the break of the Second International, and fuck it, that's what World War I was about, right? That's when all hell broke loose. And by the way, the name of our group is Platypus 1917, and it's really a key point in history, we think. And take it away, Danny.
No,
I'm way on.
No, I'm just trying to. So we're gonna bring this whole point. I think the whole point that you're trying to get at is that, you know, when does socialism become an idea? It becomes an idea in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. So the way that Engels puts it is, it's a reflex. People look out at the factory floor and they go, what about socialism? Right? Like that. Literally the concept of socialism comes out of the factory. I was just mentioning that the most communist thing is the factory. It already equalizes everything.
And look how big it is even in 2019. So is it still relevant? It's not Marxism, but socialism, right? It wouldn't have been in 1860 to what it is today. Is Marx relevant? Maybe. Anyway, go ahead.
Right.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, this is, in other words, that socialism, I think if I can draw the thread out that you were doing, and you were bringing up the symptomology thing, is that socialism has become part of capitalism, or always was a part of capitalism. Meaning,
when I listened to Limbaugh on the way into this talk, I was realizing, like, if he didn't have socialism, he couldn't be an arch-conservative talk show host. He has to be able to call Bernie Sanders a socialist, right? Without, you know, these guys are just throwing around these words, you know, at will. They have no meaning behind them, really.
They called Obama a socialist.
Yeah,
right.
My dad loves Limbaugh. So that is like my childhood, like growing up, and what he's probably hearing all the time every day.
This is like a pattern. It's like everyone whose parents are like Rush Limbaugh.
Here we are.
That my dad, when you're talking about how socialism is a reflex, it can be very frustrating because it's not a reflex for everyone. My dad, I grew up like impoverished. My dad still works he's sick. He's physically sick from all the physical labor that he's done. He has a lot of stress about bills and all of these things, and that causes mental stress. And so, but he still just holds on to this, and I wish that he could see it. So for me, that's where socialism was the reflex of it. I saw what it was like growing up in those material conditions. I could make connections and all
But
of
look
that.
how we poor working class people, right? Like, we reject socialism. You know, like that is not our answer.
Yeah, because
I was mad at these guys who were hanging off the bridge yesterday. You know, I work out in Baytown, right? I'm like, do they realize that they're stopping the truckers? You know how many truckers I drive by to go to work? And I'm like, we got to go to work. We don't have time to be,
Right.
you know, like waiting on you to improve the world. And I should know better, right? I have good, you know, progressive thoughts. I mean, I was with Pacifica for 20 years,
yeah.
right? But it's like more and more, it's like, you know, I'm a laborer. I got a blue collar job where I teach, you know. And,
I have a question. So didn't Bernie Sanders like first come up with something? So the word that he uses to describe his political views has like some socialism in it, but it's like a very different concept. And then just because there's a socialism in it, right wingers were like, oh, he's a socialist, communist, you know? But he's not actually.
well, I guess my point was,
Yeah, I know, but like in this campaign, I'm talking.
He calls himself a democratic
Democratic, yeah.
socialist.
Yeah,
So
that's
he
something-
he really aligns himself with like the European model
Yeah,
of
not the
socialism.
brown people
Yeah.
socialism.
It's,
He uses the white people
he-
socialism.
Yeah, he goes to like the Finlands and the stuff like that. He says he wants to just have like a welfare state essentially.
well, I think my point is, look, I'm identifying with like the way socialism is now being dismissed, right? So Bernie Sanders brought it to us in 2016, and now most of us are like, that's old school. And in fact, Trump is going to win calling the Democrats socialists. You know, that's, and so like my point in identifying with your dad is like, we're like, socialism is not our answer. It's been totally screwing us
Well,
for 100 years.
So, all right, let me bring in two things. So, one, it's what you're mentioning with your dad, and then you're also mentioning Bernie Sanders right now. Because I remember the Ezra Klein thing when he first announced in maybe 2015, and Ezra Klein said, "Are you socialist?" And he goes, democratic socialist," right? This kind of thing right there. So, what is relating these two strands? The 20th century, because the 20th century is just the spectacular failure of communism. Right, so whenever you want to get something going, you go, hey, have you heard about socialism? Someone goes, doesn't that lead to gulags and fascism and the state and they're going to take my guns and stuff? And we might go, no, that's not what I want, but history appears to validate that.
Certainly.
Because, in fact, I can't just go, you haven't read Capital in chapter 18, blah, blah, blah. That's not going to win anyone over. Because the natural history that we've been born into is the one of the failure of Marxism, in fact. And this is kind of a Platypus point. This is why you were mentioning Platypus 1917, which is that the way that the 20th century responded to the failure of socialism is it actually accommodated to the defeats, even in a kind of obscure fashion. So by people saying, oh, well, the problem is they didn't have democratic socialism, or the problem was like, I don't know, it's like the Nazis or something like that. Like we would have had socialism, but instead the Nazis or FD, I don't know, whatever various kinds of strands there are. But the point there is that we can see, going back to the subtitle, is Marx relevant? Well, yeah, as soon as, not even socialism, but you just talk about, hey, we should have a union, people are like, oh, what are you, a pinko communist? And so Marx haunts the present.
Whenever I say Marx, I feel like a pariah. It takes courage for me to say I'm going to talk
For me
about
too,
Marx.
yeah.
Anywhere I am.
I just say I'm a leftist. Like if I'm not sure where I am, I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm a leftist.
In what sense you're a communist? Are you a Marxist or a Leninist or just like a, I don't know. Okay, I don't know. I'm a leftist, I'm communist. When I say something, they're gonna be like, he did that, like they're just gonna.
Right.
Well, my point was that if you Google Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas, or Nietzsche, like they don't have the same impact, right?
Yes.
Shakespeare maybe has and I guess I don't want to take us into like a popularity contest, but maybe Shakespeare has the power. Like if I say to my students, I don't need you to be Shakespeare, like they get my point, right? And if I say Marx, everybody, basically I feel like people are clenching and they're like, why did you say that name?
It's not as controversial. I mean, yeah, whatever people can find, like, did Shakespeare say something anti-Semitic in Merchant of Venice, or did he smoke weed, or was it like 3 people? I don't know, like, whatever these Shakespearean things are. But Marx is like, it's very hard for people to be ambivalent on Marx in a way that they can be, even with Nietzsche, like, people will say, well, his sister was like a Nazi, but you can find letters of Nietzsche denouncing anti-Semitism or something like that. But if you say Marx, like, you know, when you talk to your friends and you go, I'm a leftist, and they go, gulags or something like that. That actually is a reflection of a century. That, you know, this is why 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds on campus spontaneously reproduce the 20th century, because they're born into the society in the same way that their parents were. And they just naturally they see the poster, is Marx relevant? And I'm surprised nobody wrote on that poster, because we've had it in the past.
I was watching it, I saw it in Michelini.
Oh, did someone write on the poster?
No,
Okay.
but I was looking every day when I went to class. It caught my eye because I was like, oh. And then I had to Google to make sure that this wasn't some like conservative thing.
Thank
I was
you.
like walking into a conservative talk, but
The old switcheroo.
In the past, people have written, go read, you know, the Gulag Archipelago, right? Like, oh, we know where Marx leads or something like that. So the question that we try to raise in Platypus is we actually try to give a space for people to just think about Marx without even being tied to having some kind of political responsibility in a way. Where it's like, if you read this, are you going to start throwing, you know, people in this room in gulags or something?
is anybody an anthropology or sociology major or minor or anything like that? So you might encounter a lot of talk about Marx and sociology, but when you talk about like the fist clenching when he's mentioned, that does happen because in anthropology and sociology they use Marxist theory of
Certainly.
material to analyze archaeological remains and those kinds of things. And it is funny because I think among anthropologists it's pretty chill to talk about Marx, but when you have non-anthropology majors in anthropology classes and they talk about it, it is this like awkward, like you can kind of feel it in the room. Like it's just intense. It's like, oh.
I mean, he's essentially the devil of the
And
20th century.
And it's not even talking really about his political or anything like that. It's just how we use his theory to analyze class history and
Yeah, so
what-
something about
what it looks
Freud
like
in that
in our
light. I don't
culture.
think we use Freud the way we use Marx, right? Is Marx relevant? I was thinking, well, Freud really isn't. You know, you got to really sort of, and I like him. I think he's important, right? But you almost have to think about Freud metaphorically or something, right?
There wasn't a political movement in the 20th century that changed the world. Like, in other words, it's impossible to think about the 20th century without Marxism. Because if 1917 didn't happen, right, the October Revolution, then how do you explain, like, World War II? How do you explain the Cold War? How do you explain the Vietnam War? You know, how do you explain all these? How do you explain the end of World War I? How do you explain China? How do you explain every philosophy, like Heidegger or anything like that, which has connection to everything? How do you explain, you know, neoliberalism? How do you explain Reagan? How do you explain Thatcher? How do you explain any of these things without it? So the reason why we hold this 1917 is not because we're like, that's the great success, but that was the greatest attempt to transform human history. And so that's why we're centering around. And let me just, one more thing. Because I was just going to say in terms of 1917, why do we even talk about Marxism today? Because of 1917. You know, if the October Revolution had not happened, Marx would have just been this kind of bohemian, goofy guy from Rhine who wrote this crazy Hegelian Rococo that he called Das Kapital. And people were like, oh, this guy was like, you know, like Weber, right? He's one of the fathers of sociology. He taught Marx. And he was like, oh, yeah, this is like an interesting guy, but we know better. That's all it would have ever been in terms of Marxism. Is just your idiosyncratic, you know, eccentric, you know, professor talking about this weird guy in the 19th century.
Yeah, I was just going to try to remember that phrase. It's the first time that a subaltern class ever took power, 1917. Isn't that how it said? Yeah. That's pretty impressive,
And a political movement, yeah.
Like normally revolutions are what? Just one class taking over? Or no, like somebody not privileged defeating the king and becoming king or something like this.
They were coups, weren't they?
Yeah, basically.
Because
coups,
the status quo remained, all you did was change heads.
That's what I was trying to say.
Revolution, most people's first thoughts is like violence. But if you look at it more like in a Latin-based thing, revolución. Revolución means change. And that's really what like a revolution is. Like it changes whatever it's describing. So, like, for example, the Industrial Revolution,
Yes.
it wasn't some violent upheaval or anything. It was industry changing society.
That's such a good point.
That's
Or how
actually
we don't view the Industrial Revolution as violent, even though it could be argued that
Sure.
it was, like for a lot of people dying in factories and those kinds of things. But yeah, that's
But we also don't view it as a revolution, even. Like, in
No.
other words, one of Engels' points is that people just were like, oh, we're just more productive now. In fact, that's actually the ideological aspect, is people just go, oh, we used to produce 10 widgets, but now I got a steam engine, I have 100 widgets. And his point is, no, we have a qualitatively different society now.
What do you guys? Okay, so this could be like kind of not on the point what we were talking
Yeah.
about, but 2 days ago I went to the job fair. I can't pronounce career very much. And then so in this job fair there was what was that company's name? Parker. So they're really like they're everywhere in like the middle, like small towns. Like they have like a huge like tech. It's like a big tech engineering company. And then they were in that room talking about how their company operates. You know how the new nowadays corporate system. It's not like the old sense of corporate system anymore. Cause like if you go to Facebook, I've been into their buildings and stuff, or like any tech companies, any like new coming like company models. They said that they paid for their master's degree, so they will be more useful. Because in the other coffee break, we talk about how like capitalism wants you to be useful, like so that's why they want you to like study and stuff. The only reason, not because of as a person, like personal growth. They care about your, like your
Or your
ideas,
freedom,
or like
or
you
your
being here
expression.
today talking about stuff. This is not going to impact them because the only thing you care about, everyone in this room cares about, how am I gonna feed myself at the end of this? And then they were talking about how they pay for their masters, how they pay for everything, the company car and all that stuff. And then 10 years ago, you will think that, oh my God, that's awesome, like, because like they were getting paid $10 per hour or something. And then now it's like that, and they pay for everything else. So it makes capitalism look so appealing now.
Yeah.
It's like they want capitalism to be hip again, I guess.
Mhm.
Like so it's like at the same time, to me, it sounds like a little bit influenced by socialism, because they are trying to make it look like they care about the people in the company. Everyone has a voice in the thing, but they actually operate all those small towns. Like everyone in that small town works there, or like it's like so 18th century,
Are they company towns?
Yeah,
Wow.
everyone in that town works there. They were like talking about it. I was like, you literally own all those people. And then I was going to raise my voice and ask, so in what conditions does your factory people work? Because they were only talking about the
The office
engineers
jobs.
and
Yeah.
stuff.
The white collar stuff.
They didn't let me talk, ask the question. It
It's
was,
awesome.
and I just like walked
They
out.
shut you down? Wow.
Because it was so disturbing. Like, okay, they tell me that I'm gonna get paid this much, I'm gonna get a life insurance, even like, I can't even go to the doctor to fix my eye, like, they're like, we're paying for your LASIK surgery and stuff. And then it looked fancy, but at the same time, it was very, like, narcissistic. Like, it's all based on the educated, it's like if you're educated and if you like attend to these meetings and like or like raise your voice and stuff, you are going to a different spectrum that they don't want you to go. So they want to like lock you in there to like to give you all those opportunities, and then they act like they couldn't give those kind of opportunities 20 years ago, and then now when they're giving you, you're like, it's the very we're acting like poor people, because we're all poor. Like, we have that poor people mentality, so we get like hyped up, oh my God, company car, free
Isn't
meal,
it the realistic one?
which is
It's
like
better than the
nothing for
temporarily
them.
embarrassed millionaires.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Well, what
I
is
would just
that?
say you compared it to how it's kind of like socialism, but it's socialism from the company
Yeah.
and not the
Yeah,
state.
yeah.
So if you lose your job, like you lose like all of that.
Yes.
You're
Yeah.
thrown out of their society.
And it's not it seems like you're right, it seems like shiny and like and great because like you need all that stuff and like you deserve to be taken care of because you're a human. And that's the other thing too is they make they make an assessment of who deserves to be given these things and who deserves this and then who doesn't, and then they split it.
And then everyone's
That way,
happy
yeah.
with what they have.
Yeah.
They don't even question because they have the company car.
So this is a great point. I think this goes back to when I was talking about the reflex part, which is socialism for Marx was, and this relates to the Rousseau, just society being true to itself, returning the quote-unquote natural state, which doesn't mean going back into the forest, but the actual potential in society. Meaning, yeah, we can obviously provide everybody with healthcare and housing
Yeah.
and food. And that, like, starting in 2019, but Marx's point is we've been able to do that since the 19th century.
Yeah.
Meaning, unemployment is that we're overproducing laborers. It's not, like today it's crazy when people go, oh, people starve because of population. No, we can feed the fucking world like multiple times over.
Yeah.
That's not an issue.
Everyone could live in the United States. Everyone in the
Oh,
world
yeah.
could live, easy. Everyone could live in Texas.
Yeah.
We could like support them in Texas if we only like farmed and raised animals in Texas. We could support the whole world. Like it's
Danny's brought up a good point previous times, like the housing crisis.
Mhm.
Like what was it?
Yes.
Most people, will tell you something about like dividends and like insurances moving ships and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, there were too many houses and not enough people living in them.
And we still have empty houses and people sleeping under the
Yeah.
freeways.
Yep.
And so this brings up the question about capitalism. Like, what happened to it? What happened to its emancipatory potential? It became unconscious. There's nothing guiding it. And so a rational mind, an individual would say, well, no, yeah, just stick those people in houses. But somehow,
Well, okay,
something's
so
changing.
all right, so let's follow this thread of where this contradiction is then right there. Why can't I literally just go, there's like, I'm friends with this guy in my neighborhood who's homeless, right? He drives around on the bike. We could put him in different houses every night. You could go in this house and then go in another house. Okay, so why wouldn't that be done? Because the property value would instantly fall an enormous amount. And that would hurt the asset side of a bank, and there would create a lot of credit frictions in the economy. And probably a lot of people employed would not be employed anymore. And so this gets to the absurdity of the whole thing. Physically, I can see we can literally put them in the house. But the reason we suffer from overproduction is because the forces of production have outstripped the relations. So the absurdity is reflected in the contradiction right there.
Yeah.
So this is why the necessity of a revolution is because this is not something that's going to be overcome unconsciously. It's not going to be like, oh, who was the guy, Lloyd Blankfein, the Goldman Sachs guy who said, I'm doing God's work?
Blankford?
Whatever his name. The guy who, after he, participated in crashing the economy, got a golden parachute and is like, I'm doing God's work or whatever, okay? This is during the Great Recession. It's not like, oh, well, if I get rid of him and put whoever I want, to head Goldman Sachs, Bjork, right? Put whoever we want, someone we like, yeah, right? That's not going to change anything right there. It's not like you just put angels in Goldman Sachs and that solves it. But you literally need society to revolutionize itself. And capitalism is a revolution, in fact, but it's an unconscious one. It's happening the housing crisis was a revolution.
yeah.
But it wasn't like, yay, we're free now. It's like, we're free of houses now.
Yeah.
It's an
Would
absurdity.
you say that the housing crisis was the first revolution since the revolution of the New Left in the 60s?
No, because you could say
That
that
is
Reagan and Thatcher, that was a revolution. There have been also political ones as well, Newt Gingrich said he was a revolution, and that's true.
And, that's just only America. There's the rest of the world.
Yeah, there's been, Venezuela also since then. But what I was thinking about is that the housing bubble actually was a revolution, meaning that what happens in a crisis is, in order to restore the stability of the economy, we have to just get rid of things. And so we had to restore housing prices by kicking people out of houses. In World War I, we had too many workers, so we just have them go shoot each other in a trench, and that solves the labor crisis.
It's interesting that capitalism
is itself a crisis of the bourgeois revolution, but then as a crisis, it has its own crises and reconstitutes itself on that basis. It's weird.
What most people call people will say, oh, it's a crisis of capitalism, but for Marx, capitalism just was a crisis.
Yeah.
Meaning when things are going good and unemployment is low, it's a crisis. But people respond to when, they're thrown out of their job, which is intuitive, yeah. So yeah, this is a good point, which is that now people read Marx today as if he's like predicting business cycles. And it's like, no, when things are good, it's a crisis. It's not just when, the economy tanks as well.
Could you understand on a micro sense? Because we always talk about it in the aggregate, but even I feel like there has to be a way within reading Marx and understanding it that you could explain the crisis of capitalism in a micro sense, in someone's day-to-day life, not just through being fired, but just not getting the full enjoyment of their labor.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that even goes for higher ups as well. That goes for people
Of course.
they're not even though they're getting maybe the full economic output of their labor, they may not be getting the full enjoyment or full,
1 week that we
freedom.
So we did this during the summer. If you remember when we did the post-Stone and Nicholas week, you can just get at capitalism through nihilism. So if you look at this chart that was posted right here, nihilism, we used to read Nietzsche in the past, and I think this is why the nihilism is down. We read Adam Smith instead of Nietzsche now. But I just missed it. Sure. But Nietzsche, he doesn't know about Marx. He knows about the socialists and has some views about them. But he basically gets at capitalism just through nihilism. He calls it a historical sickness. It's one that us moderns. But he calls it a pregnant sickness, in fact, meaning it has a potential pointing beyond itself. And he's just looking at the nihilism in life, the asceticism. He looks at, he was a historian, and he looks at, these people study all these different histories, and is there any meaning to it? And he has this great, belletristic phrase where he says, they're drowning in the bibliographic dust of Quizphilia. Where it's like, I'm in academia, what's the point of academia? You find a little niche, and then you just do it into the dust, and then that's your life apparently. It's like, oh, I studied some random thing no one cares about for 4 years in Gaelic or something like that. But the point is, exactly, that the nihilism, the ennui that people experience in their life, and this is what the 60s really experienced. When the New Left emerged, it wasn't really out of an economic crisis. It was out of, I'm just being, I'm going to have to take up the imperial war machine of America. And what's the point of this? And, I'm going to go join the man. I'm going to be in corporate. And it's leave it to beaver. Everybody's the same. The homogeneity of things. And that's how people got at capitalism. Because that's a reflection of the factory. Standardization, right? The meaninglessness of work. It's like, I just kind of add a little thing. It's Charlie Chaplin. I'm not even there. My arms are over here. Yeah, what's the point of this? I have nothing to do with this. I work 8 hours and then I go home and live my life. That's the opposite of Adam Smith. With Adam Smith, you're actually developing yourself. You're most human when you're working. For us, it's like, no, that's a bunch of shit I have to do. And then I can go live my life and watch Netflix. That's what modern life is. That's a regression on the bourgeois vision. That's a regression on the whole thing. So, it doesn't have to be only when people get fired. Obviously, it's easier to talk to someone sometimes. It's easier for fascists also to talk to someone when they're fired, unfortunately.
But I think that's why I think it's almost a more constructive way sometimes. 'Cause it's it's not as reactionary. It's because some people are they're gonna react to this and be like, they're gonna hold on to what they have,
Of
When we
course.
talk to them, they're gonna say, hey, it may not be easy for me, but I am in college right now. I'm doing something, right? Something's going right for me right now. And you're you can point out that, maybe things aren't going the worst, but it's not as good as it could be.
I think that's why the freedom to be and freedom to become question.
Yeah, that's what that was really interesting.
Right? In other words, that, Kant is really going to put it in a very nice way, which is he's just going to say the highest duty you have is the fullest development of human potential.
Yeah.
Do you think that still applies today, or do you think it's become anachronistic?
Well, I think, the Marx quote that he read at the beginning is that the full becoming of society we experience as nihilism and meaningless. Like, in other words, the economy is becoming all the time. It has nothing to do with, it appears like it has nothing to do with men. Right? We're constantly developing potential all the time, and it's just chugging along, and we're just wasting potential that we could have used. I think that's how Chris once just described capitalism. You're in the room. He just went, it's just a waste of human potential. And
He said human life is kind of a waste under capitalism.
yeah, and so what was Marx's point? Well, if your life's going to be used up, you might as well use it for socialism so that it could be redeemed and not be wasted at, Bed Bath and Beyond.
Oh my, that was personal.
That was personal. That's how I realized, you want to talk about nihilism? It was me putting vacuum cleaners up at 5 a.m. and being like, there's no reason this job has to exist.
I like the image of you're fronting the product, right? Your whole purpose is to make sure the shelves.
I was like, if I
full.
fell down,
Beautiful.
if I fell down, they'd be like, oh. 2 hours later, they'd be like, how long have you been here or something? There was no point to that. So why does that job exist? Because there would be riots if jobs like that didn't exist. For the very political stability of society, you need jobs.
What role do you think, what's it called, the consumerism, the consumer culture now, and also credit and all that, those huge post-industrial and late-stage capitalism, things that have arisen, what role do you think those all play, and what sort of impediments do they put on any future socialist endeavors?
We could. Yeah, I'll say something quickly and then.
Oh no! Well, I was just gonna say really short that they are impediments because I
But
think
they're also
it was
possibilities, right?
they're all,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is that even consumerism, mindless consumption, is still the development of the potential, the infinite diversity of things that people could do. Now, it comes across as a really nihilistic way right now, but it is this question of I think even Marx makes this point at one time, keeping up with the Joneses, you guys might have heard in some of your classes, that even that could have a potential. In a socialist society, they could look back and say, oh, that's how we developed the taste and potential of humanity, is they used to just be obsessed about oh, this cost me $20 and it cost you $10, so I'm better. That even that played a part in that sense. Right now, it seems like a way of people accommodating, right? It's what's the point of working 10 hours at Bed Bath & Beyond? Because with that income, you watch Netflix or something, or
You have to go buy some new shoes.
buy Adidas.
It's you need consumerism to define who you are. I have this bag and then I have this outfit. You guys look at me, I was like, okay, she is someone. You see a character, you see a character from a show or whatever. Someone dressed me up and you could even have assumptions about me, about who I am, about how I present myself, and I choose to present myself in this way, so you could have some assumptions about me. It's the need of expression and need of and then we use money as a source to, and buying stuff as a source to do that, which is so fucked up, but that's the way we live. So
I was thinking about the purpose when you were talking, see, a lot of things go through my head at once, but when I said Marx yesterday, I felt like the people I was talking to tried to outdistance me, right? And what I'm trying to do in this life, because I have a kid, right, and I think about my end and the purpose that I'm here for, and I really think, it should count, right? And I think I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think it counted. And I'm not trying to outdo anybody, with my outfit or anything like that. Not that I can get around it, I'm trying to be pure about it. But it seems to me if you're not just trading the latest fashions or the latest terms or something like that, then you're not really with it. And if you say something like, I'm going to talk about Marx on Friday, there's this big like you dropped a wet phone book or something. You know what a phone book is? It's like, you know, it's like why would you do that? Like and of course there's all kinds of stuff in the air about Marxism, right? From McCarthyism in this country and stuff, but still it's like that's not what we're trading these days or something. It's my feel.
I mean, if we take up fashion, right? On the one hand, it seems like people are we feel enslaved to fashion today, right? And this doesn't just have to be with what's popular. It's also if at work there's certain ways you have to dress or stuff. You have to go get a suit if you're going to go and be a professional academic.
I mean, I consciously wore a black shirt today because I'm talking. You know,
Sure.
I would have worn shorts.
Your outfit is fine. That's not the issue.
So we do that. We are in society. I
But
recognize that. Yeah.
Going back to the Marx quote, the Grundrisse quote, right? Like, in other words, one could say that through fashion, what appeared to be just kind of trend chasing, it actually is always spurning something new, right? It's at least spurning all of these different fashion businesses that only care about greed and stuff to have to think up something new, or have to think up some kind of different trend or something like that. That it actually is an expression of freedom. But it happens in an unconscious way such that we feel enslaved by such freedom. This is why, one way to put capitalism is we're slaves to our freedom, which seems kind of paradoxical. Whereas what should be emancipatory, right, instead is something unconscious. Were you there when we did the crack hour?
Yeah.
You were there when we did the crack hour, right? So he basically does what you did in terms of myth and fairy tales, right? It's his own way of kind of interestingly doing it. And he says, you can think of all of human history as the demythologization, right? We approach nature, we had to make up myths about it, and then as we learned about nature, we turned it into a fairy tale. Because what happens in a fairy tale, it's humanity wins out through reason. That's why a nice bow at the end of the story. And the way that he puts it is capitalism threatens to re-mythologization, however you wanted to mythologize something. Because now the same ratio, the same reason, the same way that we've learned to develop ourselves, now confronts us as something from without, as estranged. And so capitalism is a freedom problem. Even the things that seem to be the most dehumanizing things could be their opposite. It could be the potential for the full transformation of us all the time.
It takes me a long time to get that.
Well, because
another 3 years of studying this.
Well, here's the thing.
Yeah.
We just don't have the political subject to put such into place. So when, random Danny Jacobs says this
Right.
on a Friday, you're like, who the hell is this kid?
Right.
Because it looks like utopian speculations that I'm making up, right? Whereas for Marx, it was like a real possibility because there was a mass socialist movement, and what he found his duty to do was to clarify the point of the goal, the contradiction of such. Whereas we don't even have that today. So now when people read Marx, it's like, people think of him as like a philosopher. It's like Monty Python's philosophy soccer, if you've seen the skit.
Yeah.
And Marx is just another philosopher with Socrates and Aristotle. It's like, no! Right? He's not just like, well, what about this? He's like, actually, no, there's a real potential in society. But today it looks like that.
Fleet, you were going to say something.
Yeah, Fleet.
Oh, I just keep thinking it's like the upside down.
Yeah.
Capitalism. It's like unfreedom.
Certainly.
Yeah.
It's like everything. It's like but it's like the same. It's just like killing you,
Oh, yeah.
But it's like it's just a different. It's like it's like the form of our freedom, but like the form of our freedom that keeps us from realizing our freedom.
Yeah, for me, it's like capitalism put in this idea of freedom. It let us all see that it let us all see the potential. Like we all see it,
Yeah.
but it doesn't actually let us reach it. It doesn't
Yes.
actually let us, it tells us you can be whatever you want,
Uh-huh.
but not really. You can be whatever you want. Maybe if you're like a millionaire or
And
something.
if you don't get to it, then it's your fault.
Yeah.
You didn't work hard enough. You didn't try hard enough.
You should have slept 2 hours instead of 3.
Yeah, exactly.
No, but that's the meaning of socialism for Marx. In other words, that's the way that the task appeared.
Yeah.
Capitalism was like, here you go.
In the same way that everyone's just an embarrassed millionaire, everyone's also just an embarrassed Marxist.
Yeah,
I feel like
that's
everyone-
what I'm trying to tell everyone on this campus.
Yeah. Like you're already like you don't need like that's what you said a million times. You don't need to read Marx. You know, it doesn't
Yeah.
take a genius.
Yeah.
But this is the thing as well. Like when it comes to Marx, it's like it ought to be the case that everybody's everybody's interested in freedom. And I understand why there are people who will never become Marxists, but it's not like you can read into them of the kind of historical baggage that they have that comes with. Like my parents are never going to become Marxists. Obviously, I'm not even would never try such. They lived through the Cold War, right? And they lived through and the threat of the fear of communism and all these things like that. So if you say to your mom, you should read. This is the Communist Manifesto. It should be like, oh, my son, who is,
But everybody can agree that it's a thing that ought to exist, and it's an amazing thing,
What?
Marx, and this kind of thought that we're pursuing, just the same as Newton or something. It's just beautiful in and of itself. You don't have to really get into it, right? But everybody can agree, like it's good that exists.
Yeah.
Marx?
Yeah,
Everybody?
they should.
Oh, well, okay.
It's
so
good
they
that Shakespeare.
should.
It's good that Shakespeare exists, right? It's good. Like things are good. It's good.
So if I go over to the Republicans on campus, they're like the worst mistake in history is Karl Marx.
Right.
But
We shouldn't like them.
we should invite them.
I was going to.
But the point would be that freedom. Like in other words, if I go over to the Republicans, what are they going to talk about? They're going to say, "Oh, we care about freedom,"
Yeah.
and I'm going to say, "Amen, brother."
Right.
Right?
Like,
Like,
the project, the Rousseau project, right? This whole beautiful concept.
But
Humans could attain to something more than just watching whatever people watch on television.
But I think at the same time, just because the reason people hate the socialists and stuff, we're like people who's out there socialists, like known ones. They're usually intellectual people, and they like they're academicians or something. I mean, you know what I mean. And then so they look like they're just a bunch of people who thinks they know everything.
Yeah.
And then it's also true at the same time that historians and when people talk about concepts, even when you talk about your friend, you just think that people are stupid. You just think that you just know everything. Like you assume that people do this because of this, and then you attribute them some kind of roles and stuff, even by just saying that, because they, like he said, you don't have to be a genius to understand communism is a good thing. Like you can just you don't have to read anything to I never read Communist Manifesto or anything. I'm just here expressing my own thoughts.
Yes.
And then anyone can do this.
Absolutely.
But just because we hear intellectuals are saying that people do this, and they're like, you know too much. They're like, they just want to prove us wrong because we sound so obnoxious.
Yeah.
I agree with this. This is one of my critiques of the left from the left is I don't know. So I come from a background where none of my parents, no one in my family went to college. I'm the first person to ever go to college. It took me a little bit to get here.
Same.
I had to work a few years, and then I finally started going. So they do view it as this elite ideology, an ideology of the elite, and that you don't know working class experiences, therefore you can't talk on them or tell us what is good for us. That's the way that they view that.
Yeah.
And I think that you don't. I was a socialist ever since I understood money. Ever since I saw my parents freaking out over not being able to pay the bills. What happened when I read Marx was that I just had the vocabulary to express those ideas better than I had before. That's really all that happened. You don't have to be a genius.
It's one of these things as well that, Marxism has never brought the working class anything. And if it's brought them anything, a lot of them would say, well, it brought us death and destruction. Right? If they say, well, didn't you guys try this crazy experiment in Europe and it just led to and by the way, a lot of conservatives will just say, oh, fascism is socialism. And as we got a few weeks ago, that's true.
Yes.
Right? That's not, they're not wrong about that. So they're just wrong about what's meant by that. But yes. But, in terms of Marx, of course it looks today like some kind of, esoteric idea that people just flirt with or something like that. I guess I would say two things. One, I would say part of this chapter or this organization is that we try to use that to our advantage,
Yeah.
which is that by it just being an idea, we're hoping that people can just consider it. like actually flirt with it without having to be like, how are you? You know, what does this mean instantly? But just think, oh, well, maybe this only meant something in the 19th century.
Leave the ideology out of it.
We should also be careful not to, when we talk about like the theory being like inaccessible to working class people, it's a little condescending. It's like the idea that working class people can't understand theory. So if you know, a construction worker did pick up the Communist Manifesto, he or she would be like, well, I don't understand any of this. That's not true either.
What actually might be, it might be the case that Marxism, that none of us understand Marxism today.
Yeah.
That's actually the point. So when I say something like that, because this has been a point that I've tried to make a lot, which is that people would obviously understand something reading either the manifesto or Capital, but they might understand something completely opposite.
Well, a lot of it also is access and time to ingest that information and actually have access to that information. I read Marx because I was a college student who had free time on my hands, but my dad could never read Marx because he's working all day and into the late night.
Yeah.
And so, and then, you know, even if he did have time, would he be able to, I mean, I know it's cheap, but would he be able to spare a few bucks to buy the book? Or
$24
make his way to the library to rent it?
Or even like, why would he even be compelled to
Yes.
to read it when it, in so many ways, feels kind of like irrelevant?
Yeah.
Because it, like in history, like right now, it feels very irrelevant, and it almost is, even though that irrelevance is also in a way it's relevant because that just points, you know, more than anything to the need to resolve the problems that are as yet unresolved.
So everybody, like, obviously people can read things and understand words. I think the point is, what does Marxism mean to us today? And that when people, you know, for example, like if I haven't been in a humanities class in a while, but like if people are in them and they, you know, have a discussion like this, and your professor's like, well, what do you guys think of Marx? And someone raises their hand, they go, he killed 100 million people. Like, that's the first thing someone says. And then another person says, he had good ideas, you know, like Bernie Sanders has some, right? This is like a common conversation that's going to play out in a class like that. And this is people registering history. Whether or not they've even read one word of the Communist Manifesto, association with those things
Yeah,
like
they
that.
watched Chernobyl.
They watched Chernobyl. I like Chernobyl.
I
It's a
did
good
too,
show.
But my dad came to me, he watched Chernobyl, and he said, did you see Chernobyl? He's like, can you believe that happened in the Soviet Union? And I was like, well, Dad, I mean, I brought up 3 Mile Island and
Sure.
all the other...
You could say it's a testament to the power of communism, meaning those people were willing to run into, like, you know, when they're talking to the engineers and they go, some of you are going to have to run into the factory, and you will likely die. And they're like,
I'll do it.
for communism, you know, for the that's the testament of things right there. That they're like, you know what, I want to,
Yeah, they think their lives are not being wasted.
I still believe in communism. I will go in and take nuclear radiation. So to me, I didn't think it was anti-communist. I thought
I didn't think it was either, and the writers themselves said it wasn't.
Yeah.
But there was this automatic, like, I don't know, they just...
People
see what they... Yeah,
people
see what
It
they
was an HBO show. It's too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
It was
The British
intense.
Russians.
Yeah, that show was intense.
I like the science behind that. It was good.
But but today, like in terms of Marxism, would not elicit the same response today,
Sure.
right? If there was another unfortunate reactor meltdown, I couldn't be like, do this for Marxism to somebody, because they'd be like, what the? Yeah, but you also couldn't say do it for capitalism. So, in other words, capitalism actually doesn't justify itself on itself. Really justifies itself on other things.
Yeah, and but capitalism is also a lot more micro. It's like
Yes,
you're gonna
exactly.
be asking people to do it for their job, and people
Yes.
won't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so that's where authoritarianism kind of comes in. People are gonna be made to do that.
So this I think this goes actually to Michael's presentation, which is that what Michael was bringing up was that the intentionality of society as a whole. Right? In other words, the Bourgeois Revolution was raising the question of freedom to become, which is an intentionality of society to many different people who could have completely different opinions and views. It's saying that you all have a general interest in the fullest development of your potential. And you guys might hate each other, actually, but you still have an intentionality to what you're doing. How does one justify capitalism today? We can't even talk about society as having a direction as a whole today. Instead, it's like, oh, I do it for the money, or I do it for, I don't know, people justify capitalism on it produces more things. which is below Adam Smith. Like, that's not, you know. So the whole...
All over here is the best thing that we can come up with.
The point is that we regress in capitalism because we can't even talk about the ends of history in the same way that we did and could have done with Adam Smith. And Marxism was an attempt to try to redeem what the ends of all this crazy shit that's happening. Is that, yes, your nihilism at Bed Bath & Beyond or Kroger moving a bunch of cans forward, you're actually playing a part in world history and the development of emancipation for your grandchildren.
So,
Yeah.
So if the goal of Marxism is the end of history,
End of prehistory.
end of prehistory, and end of, you know, like the full development of human civilization, is there has to be multiple ways to get there, right? And how are we supposed to know whether Marx is the best route there?
He might be completely wrong.
Yeah.
We don't read him because we think Marx is the smartest or best person. We read Marx because Marxism was the greatest attempt to emancipate humanity in history. And the entire 20th century looks like that was the stupidest experiment that's ever happened. And that's why the conservatives over, you know, the Republicans go, you guys read Marx, he killed 1 gazillion people. because the 20th century looks like Karl Marx wrote, you know, this random thing in England, and somehow everyone's dead because of that. So we treat Marxism as a question rather than an answer.
It exists because we all are disturbed. Somebody had to express it, and then he was the one.
Yeah.
And then we just like relate with his ideas because we're all human, and then we all experience the stuff he's been talking about. Like she mentioned, I was 7 years old when they introduced me money in first grade, and then I was like, this sucks. When I grow up, I'm gonna come up with a better economical system. Like you know, when you're a kid, but I want to be a president and stuff. That's what I said. I was like, and then when I grew up in middle school, oh, Marx already came up with it. Never mind.
Oh, wow.
Somebody already said this, you know.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say what did you think of? Did you think of some alternative?
I mean, you know, 7 years old. Nothing very
Could have been a prodigy, like, we don't know, yeah.
I remember learning that they printed money and then just being like, well, why don't we just print more money?
Right? Yeah, that was the first thing.
It's like the modern day.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's MMT now. That's true, yeah.
Let's just
just make
so
more.
much money,
So
so no one
you can't
will
just
be
increase taxes.
poor.
I didn't understand why counterfeit bills didn't count. I was like, they're real.
That's why I always have to explain to because you know, I'm the same problem. I can't even talk to my dad about politics. You know,
Oh, yeah, it's-
just old white man.
Yeah.
We should bring in everybody's parents and talk about Rush Limbaugh.
Oh, he would
My mom would be throwing holy water around. So in here.
My dad would just store them out. But whenever I talk to my mom, like Mom, like you always talk about the economy and like how worried you are about it. Like we actually have social programs, but I mean we can we have the world's richest country. We can just print more money. We can just increase taxes a little bit. It's actually really easy. Like it's like if I was a dictator, I could go do it tomorrow, and I could fix the economy. I'm an 18-year-old kid or nothing.
We appreciate it.
Like,
I tried talking to my
How
mom
much do
about
we pay the robots?
Yeah.
I tried talking to my mom about a union one time because she was just talking about her work environment and just all these terrible things that were happening. I said, Mom, you know, if you had a union, like it would be, and I'm not saying like it's an easy thing. I was just saying like, you know, if you had a union, you would have a lot more, you know, rights in the workplace. And she said, if I had a union, I couldn't choose my own hours to work, and I have to be able to choose my own hours to work because she does this thing where she goes in at like 4 a.m. and leaves at super early, and she just that's how my parents are.
That's kind of misinformed, isn't it?
Oh, it's very. It's at that point she got really angry, and I was like, all right, I'm not gonna talk about this.
I mean, like for most of at least my parents' lives, like he's had unions. Like there's been a war against unions for his entire life.
Yeah, same thing with my dad. Yeah.
So and my dad's just filled to the brim with propaganda. Like watches Fox News every day, all day. So it's like.
My dad started watching Joe Rogan.
Oh, really?
I love it.
Okay, see.
He's gonna start
I'm not
doing
saying, like, not
D&D,
political
and he's like
things.
meditating and some.
Did you watch his one with Bernie Sanders?
I hope that my
I
dad
watched a
did,
bit of it.
but yeah, I just knowing all the people that go on that show, I was like, oh god, yeah, it was bad.
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
I can't watch
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders
There's
interviews
still
anymore.
a
It's
red
just
scare.
probably
Yeah,
fake.
it's
Like,
never been
like, yeah,
finished.
like I get why you do it, but
I've read
He's taking it more
that.
seriously this round.
AM
When
radio.
you say the word union, you have like It's
think
probably
actually
legal. I should
to-
stay away from this for my own good, you know?
The teachers' unions, that's the
Instead of like democratic.
big attack right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
And
I
there's
think
only a
the
few
AFL-CIO is
unions,
corrupt.
you know, like the
Yeah.
police
Well, I don't think
union.
you
Oh,
said
yeah.
you could win last time.
They're being sued.
Yeah, like that's a
This
Yeah, this
time.
week,
Won
AFL-CIO.
last time.
well, they've
The
already
leadership
protected
is being
themselves.
sued. And GM might go on strike, but the problem is.
Well, we can't give you more guns, but we can give you the electric.
I'm not gonna lie.
Did you
I
guys
want
hear when? Do you guys
$1,000.
remember when the